Welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game. I'm your host, DM Neal, aka Jote Moniac, and today we're going to be talking about Solarpunk, Hope Punk, something along those lines. There is a long line of games and modules and things with that dark, gritty, grim future, and as someone who has invested way too much money in Warhammer 40,000, I know those all too well and love them deeply. But at the same time, there is a different side of that spectrum, and we're going to be talking about that today with Ajit George, who has done several bits of work for Wizards of the Coast and is just an awesome person, and I was very happy to discuss Solarpunk with him. But before we do that, we have an iTunes review that we wanted to read, and this one comes to us from Fittypeace. Fittypeace, and they entitled it "My Brain is Bursting," 5 stars. I find out about this podcast from a Google search, and it may have been the best decision I've made in years. I've been DMing for a couple of years after a group of friends and myself discovered Critical Role and decided to give DMing a try. Well, there you go, Fittypeace. Thank you for that review, and thank you, Google SEO, for connecting us with this listener. And with that out of the way, let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
The plate meat's back on the menu, boys.
So today for the meat, we have a very special guest, and it is Ajit George, who there is a long list of fun things that I get to say after this. One of the creators and project leads for D&D's Radiant Citadel, as well as one of the writers for Ravenloft. And I think I've got this written down correctly, one of the recent Diana Jones Award winners for excellence in gaming. Ajit, thanks for coming on and spending some time with us. And this is a topic, they've already heard it in the intro, but this is a topic I'm very excited to talk about.
Neal, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'm happy to talk about Journeys to the Radiant Citadel or Ravenloft or whatever we'd like to touch on.
Perfect. And so, as always, we could do a little bit of a quick interview so that the listeners can get to know you. And honestly, it's more just for me too, so that we can get to know each other a little bit better before we dive all the way in. But is there a little bit that you can tell us about yourself, your RPG journey, or just kind of anything you think the listeners might be interested in?
Yeah, sure. Longtime player of games. I started, I think probably 2nd, 3rd grade with D&D's Red Box. Absolutely loved it. It was the weirdest, strangest thing I'd ever seen, and I got my hands on and was just completely immersed in it. But it was hard to find, fellow players. It's not the modern era. This is like early 80s, I think. And so, if you didn't have a couple of kids at school, you couldn't find players to play with. There were no online options. And so I didn't really get into playing regularly until high school. And that I had a great campaign that started from freshman year until the end of senior year, and I played just compulsively all the time through high school. It was a real salvation for me. And I think particularly it was a real salvation for me because, like a lot of geeks of that era, geeks were not cool during that era. And, we kind of were all the misfits and weirdos. But also, I was also one of the only brown kids in the entire school. And there was an extra kind of sense of isolation and, alienation. And so D&D and gaming was sort of a refuge for me, but a complex refuge in that, like, as much as I loved the game and I loved the imagination and the creativity, at the time, the art and the characters, the stories around it were very white-centric and from a white lens. And, on one hand, I could imagine myself differently, but as a, kind of a teen kid who's sort of surrounded by media that tells you, the normal for America is white, and like, most of the art is white and most of the characters are white and most of the stories are white. It was a little hard, it was a little hard to find my place. Fast forward many years. And then about 10 years ago, I got back into gaming. I played on and off through my 20s, but, about 10 years ago, I started gaming again. I got really, really back into it. But I think with a little bit more maturity and a little bit more thought process around it. And one of the things I started to ask more questions about is like, why actually aren't there a lot of brown and black people in games? And why aren't there more designers and more art and more stories? When I did get back into games about 10 years ago, I did so from the lens of like somebody who wanted to contribute to games and wanted to tell stories that spoke to me, that kind of spoke to my Indian heritage and spoke to, maybe brown kids who are growing up and might read my work and be like, hey, wow, cool. I do see myself in this. This is awesome. I'm excited to like feel the story tells something about me. And so I almost exclusively write from that perspective. The very first thing I ever wrote for any kind of game was an indie game. And it was an urban city guide, urban fantasy city guide to the city of Bangalore, which had never been touched. It's a city in India, never really been touched in a game before. And so I was the first writer to take an urban fantasy perspective on Bangalore, and kind of kept on working my way through that. Talked about these questions in different forums and different conversations. And then in 2020, I got tapped by Wes Snyder to write for Ravenloft. And that was kind of that journey to where we are today. I can kind of talk a little bit more about Ravenloft and how I got asked to do Journeys to the Raven Citadel. But yeah, that's sort of a background to me.
That is awesome. I like saying this. I'm glad you're back. Not all the stories end up person finding that love for the RPG again, because there's a lot of stories that skew a lot more negative. And then those experiences end up being the thing that person steps away forever. So from me to you, I'm glad you're back in, and you're all in because you're writing straight for WotC, and you're, like you said, you're writing from a perspective that is limited, unfortunately, and you're giving voice to those and helping others see what can be done with D&D. And I think it's awesome. So the other question I have, is there anything that you're currently working on? And I always got to throw out the fun caveat that you can tell me about.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't talk about it in terms of RPG writing. I am, I think the final stages of negotiation about a pretty major IP. I'm excited about it. I'm trying to balance that with my full-time job. So I'm going to actually probably not take the kind of lead role, but I will probably take a secondary support role in something that is, we'll probably come back and have a conversation around it because it's a very well-known IP and it's pretty big. And I think there's going to be a lot of excitement around it. So can't talk about that so much. I am currently also organizing for a con in the Bay Area in San Francisco called Big Bad Con. And I was the creator of the first networking event for people of color in games. And so the idea was, okay, so how do you break into games at all? And if you're a person of color, how do you break into games? Because, a lot of data shows, most jobs, about 80 to 85% of all jobs are acquired by people in your network, right? And well, if your network, and then there was another piece of data that said, most white people have 90 white friends for every black friend they have, right? And so, if that's the case and your network is almost entirely white and you're like kind of a lead game designer and you only hire from your network, how do you hire, some brown and black people? Well, I created a networking event that would put industry veterans from all different areas of the industry in the same room with a lot of up and coming brown and black designers. And I ran it successfully in 2019. Huge hit. A lot of people got hired at Wizards of the Coast, Critical Role, Darrington Press, Paizo, Pathfinder, Paradox, so on and so forth from it. And so we're replicating that again this year. Now that the pandemic's kind of in a more manageable position and a little bit safer to hold an event like that. So that's something gaming related, though. It's not a writing design.
No, that's perfect. And as someone who lives in California, I will change my ways and definitely go to Big Bad Con because it wasn't on my radar because I'm so used to just thinking about the elaborateness of just, okay, I got to get flights. I got to book hotels. I got to. And then in my head, I'm like, you fool, just look closer. And then the idea that I could have easily driven to Big Bad Con. So that just means next year, without a doubt, I will be there.
Yeah, it's worth coming. This year it's a small con. It's about maybe 600 people, 600 plus, and about 20% will be industry people. So you can't literally be in a game without like having somebody from one of these companies be in your game or walking the halls and meeting somebody. It's definitely worthwhile. It's a fun, small, really smart con with a lot of cutting edge games. It's a place where a lot of experimental games come out, a lot of playtesting. So it's a great con.
That is my particular brand, because the one I have gone to for a lot is a Catacon, which started from the RPG Academy and is basically like you're saying, you're just like spinning that network out a little bit bigger each time. And yeah, it's only a few hundred people, but then that same rate where it's 20 people. And so then I end up playing games that become really popular games. But then I remember when they were just games written down on note cards that get handed out by the game designer directly.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to learn a game really well when the person who made it is the person illustrating how it should be played.
It's a lot of fun.
So our third one is our surprise question. And so I've been trying to I always like kind of tailoring that surprise question. So mine that I feel like we haven't asked a lot of our guests before, what over your span of your RPG career, what is your go-to class? Like, what is the one that always draws you to it? And then the follow-up, of course, would be like, do you feel like you might be drawn to that one?
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough one. I like paladins, and I like paladins because I like their fanatical point of view. I think because I myself am a true believer in my causes and the things I work for. In my full-time profession, I am director of operations of the Shanti Bhavan Children's Project. It's an international education and poverty alleviation program based in India. And I believe completely in our work and the effectiveness of our work. In games, I believe in the advocacy for people of color, for the opportunities to acquire jobs and to uplift themselves and to get, to be part of the story and be part of the media. And so I think whenever I work towards anything, it's with a real sense of belief in the work that I'm doing and a genuine love of the work. And I think paladins are interesting to me because they have that really they are the true holy warriors for their gods, and they really believe in what they're doing. And so I think that's my favorite.
I like it. Yeah. And there's so many different ways you can play a paladin. If we want to talk about from the last 10 years opposed to the red box days, there's very different ways to play it. And I love that because I think it reframes the way a paladin should be played. It's just someone that is all in for their particular cause.
Yeah.
Good or ill.
Yeah, that's how I play paladins. I know there's different ways to interpret it, but I think this is where it's they really believe in what they're fighting for. They believe in the cause. They believe in the mission. They're out there kind of trying to forward that mission in the best of ways, or sometimes destructively, depending on how they play.
So with those out of the way, one of the things that we had gone back and forth about, and I think it's a wonderful topic to discuss to further promote the idea of Solarpunk or Hope Punk. It's a fairly new genre as I was looking into kind of its origins or where people think it started. Of course, the zeitgeist works in a particular way, and there's a lot of reasons we got to where it is. But throwing those words out there, what are the things that come to mind when I say Solarpunk?
Yeah, Solarpunk, you're right, it's pretty new. It started. My understanding is that the term was coined in 2008 on a blog, and it was sort of a rejection or a pushback against cyberpunk and dystopian literature, particularly sort of cyberpunk really came out of, I think, the 80s, and it was really about it tied into the Cold War, Reaganomics. There was definitely some Orientalism coming in around there. It also. Yeah, Solarpunk definitely pushes back against the cyberpunk genre, but it particularly pushes back, I think, against grimdark and dystopian literature in general, which says, I think dystopian literature is really about the road is grim and there's only one road and you're going to take this road, and that road may be interesting. There's a lot of interesting stories you could tell around it, but it's going to be, I think there's a finality to that road, right? And then grimdark is everything is terrible and it's the world's going to hell, but you can survive it, but only if you become as dark as the rest of the world, and you must embrace the darkness to survive and overcome the darkness, right? And both of those themes, or all of those themes, really don't resonate with me. There's a nihilism and kind of a doomsday kind of mindset around that that's really kind of frustrating to me. And I think about Solarpunk, I think about community. I think about a symbiotic relationship with nature in the environment around us, a sustainability, and an ability to envision the future optimistically and positively, and that it isn't winner take all, but it is a rising tide lifts all boats, right? That there's ways that we can work together and all of us can get something out of it. It is really, though, about living thoughtfully and mindfully and really strategically with your environment in a very positive collective movement. And I think those are kind of the key things. It's really, there's a very strong environmental aspect, there's a very strong communal aspect, there's a sustainable aspect. I think there's an anti-capitalist aspect to it. It doesn't need to be purely, socialist, though I think there's socialist elements to it in the best of ways. And when I think about socialism, I think, people think of it as a really like negative word. And, or at least in United States, there's a negativity attached to it. And I think they don't understand that socialism is really like public highways are socialist, right? A public school is a socialist institution. Veterans being paid, pensions and GI Bill are all socialist. Social Security is socialist. These are all things that
it's in the name.
Yeah, exactly. All the things that like take care of you and make your life easy, and make your life accessible. Hospitals, those are all have socialist elements, and those are all real positive.
Yeah, and I think, because I did a lot of research because I was so fascinated with the concept. Yeah. I think one of the things is like that may be a pretty strong misinterpretation of the idea of that Solarpunk or that hope punk is because the word dystopian is often used with the other side, that utopian is potentially used. And I don't necessarily see it that way. In a lot of what we're going to say right now is personal perspective, but like from my perspective, I don't necessarily see it as utopian in the sense that there, quote, are no problems. It's just it's a society that's set up to handle problems. Because with Grimdark, it's like, I don't know. I just need to figure out today and maybe think about tomorrow. Like, that's all I got. Whereas with this, like, there are just structures and things like things developed to be able to handle those. And even if it is some cataclysmic event that you introduce to a Solarpunk setting, it's still a societal thing where everyone realizes that's a problem for all of us, and all of us will work on this problem with the hope that we will accomplish it, not the blood red sun sets on the day and things like that. And like you said, it's this infusion of hope in everything instead of fear.
Yeah, it's a hope-based society versus a fear-based society. It's a really great way of thinking about it. It is one that has collective, strategic, smart, long-term thinking, right? I think of Solarpunk as like a community, a society that has been very smart and really strategic about surviving and thriving in challenges and growing and building in those challenges. The challenges don't defeat them, and challenges don't bring the worst out of them. Challenges actually bring the best out of them as they work together with one another. And when I think about Grimdark, it's like, yeah, today I'm just going to pick up my sword and kill the thing in front of me that's going to try to kill me. And maybe tomorrow I'll die, but I'm going to fight, as best I can. And it's like, great, that's maybe going to be sustainable for about a week, and then you're going to be dead. Or you're just going to be exhausted, right? Like, there's no long-term thinking in Grimdark. It really is really short-term. It is really, just the moment right in front of you from moment to moment living, and just kind of eking out an existence. And that seems very hard to have a fulfilling life out of that. That feels like, wow, that sounds pretty brutal. It might make for very interesting short-term stories, but even then after a while, that story feels like it can get dull, right? Whereas I think, as you said, Solarpunk is not the absence of challenges or the absence of problems. It is simply that the problems are addressed slightly differently. That this is not, problems aren't about conquest, right? It is conflict. There may be conflict, but it's not, the end is not a conquest of somebody else or some other group. That we can find these solutions to problems through other methodologies. And that's what I really like about it.
And this, the interesting thing is that, especially with the Radiant Citadel, because I always like using some of the WotC material as a touch point to start to have those conversations, because that's most likely the things that are on our listeners' shelves are books from D&D and WotC. But the idea that you can also have those Solarpunk themes and it not necessarily be the whole campaign, but you find a community that these are the ideals that they've adopted, and it could be, because Grimdark 100% of the time just is dark, and it, like you said, it can get tiresome. But like having either that sea change in the campaign that you're running, or having that bright spot within it, so that these characters and potentially your players can still have the infusion of hope by meeting this community. So I guess I'll just kind of throw it out there. Like, how does the Radiant Citadel fit into like that kind of Solarpunk mold and like adding to that genre?
I mean, the Radiant Citadel itself is very Solarpunk, right? It is, the book, I think, is a Hopunk kind of book, but the Radiant Citadel is very Solarpunk in that it's not a utopian society, but it has a quasi-utopian feel to it. That the community has figured out ways to coexist. And it's a very diverse and heterogeneous community. You've got 15 different cultures, major cultures that make it up, and probably, dozens more that are also immigrants of that city. It's an immigrant city, and they all kind of figure out ways to live peacefully, coexist with each other, but in an ecologically sound environment, while being surrounded by a pretty harsh environment around it, the ethereal plane, right? It's this floating city carved out of a fossil of an unknown creature that surrounds this life-giving giant gem called the Auroral Diamond. And, the life-giving gem allows some of the magic that happens in the city, right? Like the vegetation and the farms and the growth, all of that there, and healing and water and so on. But then you've got the ethereal plane around it, which is pretty dark and pretty dangerous. And so they figured a way that they have to survive on the city and work together to survive the larger challenges of the ethereal plane, but also because they're connected to a bunch of other civilizations. And there's interesting, I think if you look at the text and you skim it, you might be like, oh, this is like, everything seems really great and everything's peaceful. And it's like, yeah, but you actually have to look at what the connected home civilizations are, right? So there's definitely conflict there. One of the home civilizations, Akan Sangar, is ruled by an angel with very strong beliefs about what is right and wrong. And he is in conflict with, one of the leaders of the Radiant Citadel, right? And so there are some very strong external challenges. There are going to be internal challenges to different ideologies, different religious beliefs, different ways of thinking about things. How do we deal with immigrants? How do we deal with refugees? There are all these different push points of possible conflict, but they're not conflict that usually go, I'm going to beat it with a stick, a conflict, and solve it, right? It actually is long-term conflict that simmers under the surface for a little bit and then boils up over time. And I think that actually makes for a really great long-term campaign. Though you can have some really interesting short-term conflict in the Radiant Citadel without a problem.
Yeah, the idea of any two cultures mixing on any level, that there wouldn't be touch points of discussion, that's just not how it works. It's not. I mean, I only have 4 people living in this house of mine, and it doesn't work. It doesn't even work on a day-to-day basis. So the idea, that two cultures. But again, you looking to that Solarpunk, it's not that those aren't there. It's that, like you mentioned, it doesn't turn to stabbing each other or casting fireball or lightning bolt. It turns into discussions, and that those tensions are still there, but the resolution changes into something different. Because if it's grimdark and I go into area B and I'm from area A, stab. Like that's the solution 9 times out of 10. And the 10th one is just casting magic missile. But the idea that, those things are there. And I think one of the other things is, if you look at the overall space available on the Radiant Citadel, there just needs to be smarter use of it, because you do have these cultures all working in their individual areas, but like there's only a limited amount of space. So you just have to work together to make the most out of what's there.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think you've got limited space. There's a hostile external environment. There are so many different cultures and backgrounds and ideologies and ethnic heritages. And so they have to work together. And that's really emphasized in kind of like maybe the leadership council. It's called the Speakers for the Ancestors. And the Speakers for the Ancestors have enormous power, where they could, one of them could just decide to turn off all trade to the city. And there's these Concord jewels that are kind of these transport vessels that transport, goods and materials back and forth from the Radiant Citadel. And each of the Speakers of the Ancestors have the power to freeze all of those Concord jewels and stop them from doing trade. And that's sort of a powerful veto power that was my way of thinking about sometimes the dysfunction of the U.S. government and how just a couple of people can freeze all movement in legislation. And yet showing that in this case, these 15 people from different ideologies have so far to this point made it work, and that they don't use that veto power. But it's got to be some really challenging negotiations, and maybe some trading, and maybe there's some bribery even happening at times, right? I don't go into that. I let the DMs. I'm like, hey, you take this in the direction you want. How these negotiations survive, and how the city still survives. But fundamentally, I think what the speakers and ancestors understand is they are shepherds, and they are like the caretakers of the city, and like they have to negotiate, they have to find compromises. And I think that's what's interesting to me, is that, it's not that everybody gets along automatically. It's that they understand there's something bigger than themselves, something larger and more important than their own individualistic needs that they're responsible for, and that they are going to come to the table and negotiate and find solutions, sometimes complex solutions and convoluted solutions, which is a touch point and launch point for adventurers, right? That's where the stories come in. And that's where the PCs are like, oh yeah, I'm going to work with this, speaker for the ancestor to find a compromise in the situation. Or, they're tasked to find a middle ground, or maybe one of the PCs becomes a speaker of the ancestor, and they're stuck in this like really complicated role. And they're like, oh crap, I got to go do something here to solve this problem.
Well, I think about like in our modern world, and just in the past several years, the idea of like the amount of globalism that we have reached, that I don't think individual societies, be it America or anywhere else, have fully realized. And some of that comes to light when conflict happens in a different area, only to find out that maybe that person was producing something that is sent literal thousands and thousands of miles away. I mean, again, California is a touch point. Let's say California just fell off, which it's not outside the complete realm of possibility. Big enough earthquake, we just pop off. It ends up being like the third largest agricultural production if it just became its own country. And the idea that but it's not just to people in California, it's across the whole world. So, if you're not having those discussions and putting certain things aside to look at society as a whole, then, those conflicts become so much more expanded and just so much more intense when you look at it without looking at it from like that Solarpunk idea.
Yeah. And you touched on something, Neal, that is, in my writing, the Radiant Citadel in many ways is a microcosm of a lot of different things going on in our modern world. I wrote that piece in 2021 and was really, there were so many things happening at the same time while I was writing it. And what you just said about like, hey, we're all interconnected, and one thing can be a ripple effect through to others, is about the Radiant Citadel simultaneously. You get 15 different major cultures tied together there, and the impact in one area can have a ripple effect across, especially since all of these 15 cultures do a lot of trade through the Radiant Citadel. And then if things go sideways, that has an impact on, the other civilizations. They are really interconnected. There's a lot of juggling, and it's, there's just some interesting larger stories that can be told with the Radiant Citadel that we don't always get with D&D. And I think that's what is exciting to me, is that we can look at D&D from a different lens and a different angle and say, hey, there's some interesting stories that really relate to the real world and my personal experiences that I can have. Sure, you want to go kill the dragon or explore a dungeon, all of that's possible within this. We have a dragon, there is a dungeon, more than one dungeon in the book. There's all of those stories to be told, but there's also larger stories to be told.
It just dawned on me the way that a really small occurrence, I'm trying to find all the right words. My brain's going all kinds of places, and I'm trying to find all the right words. But the idea of once you have that interconnectedness, a small occurrence can create something so large. And I was looking it up because I couldn't remember when the Ever Given went sideways in the Suez Canal, not 9 months ago. The whole world was like, oh, okay, we can't send anything to anyone anywhere ever for any reason. What do we do? And it was like, do we wait it out those 6 days? And there were the people that said no, because I can't tell how long it would take. So I I'm sending my boat this other direction. Now I'm out multiple weeks, but then there's this compounding effect with, the pandemic was still going on. So even when things did go there wasn't enough people to process the things that finally did show up. And it's literally a boat went sideways.
Yeah.
One boat.
We live in a very interconnected world, and the trade aspect of the Radiant Citadel really speaks to that. I wrote that, kind of looking at these issues that were coming into play. And so, it kind of speaks to that. But even in something like the Shield Bearers, which is an organization within the Radiant Citadel, and different people have interpreted different ways. So they say it's like, it reminds them of Star Trek, it reminds them of this. It's like, well, actually, that wasn't really what I was thinking. If there's a piece of media that was influential to the Radiant Citadel, the most influential sci-fi and fantasy thing that I read around it was The Expanse. I huge fan of the science fiction show, and The Expanse really influenced my thinking about a few different things around the Radiant Citadel. But in many ways, the shield bearers are sort of meant to be like Navy SEALs or Delta Force. I think of them as being dropped into the most dangerous hot zones out there, where like things are going sideways, things are going real bad, and these are the elite units of the Radiant Citadel, and they're dropped in there, but with some very specific rules. They can't engage without being engaged first, so they can't attack an enemy until they are attacked first. And their real mission is not to go like, kill dragons or overthrow governments. Their mission is to go rescue people, civilians who are in danger, and bring them out of that danger and bring them back to the Radiant Citadel for either to relocate somewhere else, or to even just, take a new home in the Radiant Citadel. I remember in some feedback notes I got from this, one of the designers who was like looking at this was like, wow, if they can't attack first, how's that going to work? Because like, things get real messy really quick in D&D, and like, players are going to want to like throw that fireball first or shoot that magic missile first if they're in peril. And I was like, great, that's exactly what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping for them to make messy decisions or complicated decisions. Because sure, you could be like, well, these bandits are going to go kill all these villagers, and I'm going to kill the bandits first and save them. Even though the mission is like, you're not allowed to do that until you're attacked, and you're actually supposed to just go save the villagers and not stop the bandits per se. Maybe you kill those bandits, but maybe those bandits were, connected to a noble from another kingdom. And now this noble is like, you just killed my people. Wait a second. Did the Radiant Citadel declare war on my kingdom? And then the Radiant Citadel is now embroiled in a political turmoil with another kingdom because the PCs made a random decision. And that is me talking about a bunch of different things, either about D&D tropes, where PCs just go around and kill things randomly and don't really think about the consequences of those things. And also, it's a question around American interventionism. It's like, I believe there are places and times where America has to step in and do some good. But sometimes there's some real strong questions about what does good mean, whether this is the right decision, and ask some complex and challenging questions. And I don't provide easy answers. And this is one of those things where I say, hey, the Radiant Citadel is not absent of challenges. It's just these challenges are not necessarily the simplest challenges, or the ones that you're just like, binary challenges. I try to avoid that. I'm like, hey, this is not simple, easy solutions for you. You got to think about this.
Yeah, history has proven that the next guy theory isn't always a great turnout. Well, yeah, there's a lot of examples of how the next one may be much worse than the previous one. And trying to figure out how those conflicts work. And like you said, that's it's unfortunate that there's also a lot of examples of, again, using two rival, let's just say rival factions, just to blanket the statement of, if I do this, then you do that. So I do this, that you do that. And that just becomes history, to the point where even that first slight is something that is no longer even understood or known. It's just, I know that that's what we do going forward. Finding different solutions for those kind of things. And also the idea that if you even want it like a more difficult version of D&D in a good way, this is one of the things. Putting certain limitations on what a player can and can't do is one of the things as a DM to try and stretch the players, because it's one thing that I'm trying to think of the most positive way to say this, but like, if I get another athletics check from my fighter, it's like, yay, cool.
Yeah.
You did it. But the idea of either working together or working to find solutions that stretch the player, or them finding a different way that, how does athletics work? Is athletics like, I run over and I jump this wall and I stab the guy? Or is it, I am able, because now I'm super into fantasy football, so my brain sometimes go there because we're mid-season. But the idea that, like, could I pick someone up and I use my athletics check to do some of the moves that I've seen, where this 180-pound guy is trying to avoid these 300-pound guys because they don't want to be hurt. And so the idea of using the athletics check in a more inventive way, because I can't choose to use a sword, but it's also because I'm trying to protect this person at the cost of myself.
Yeah. And I think off of that too is just simply that like it's almost even going, hey, my fighter is actually more complex than like a meathead with a sword, right? It's like, sometimes I think we go to the core stereotype and is like, sure, maybe that's like how the character started. Maybe he was the guy that was just like, I'm brawn with a sword and I'm just going to beat things down. And then he's suddenly put into these more complex situations where he's like, wait a second, I can't just beat this thing down. Like, I have to kind of think about something new. And it's like, I think that's where the richest moments in role play come in, where you realize something new about your characters. You're like, oh my God, my character is growing. My character is taking a new direction that I didn't pre-program or I didn't envision for him or for her. I think that's where some of the magic happens in a game for me is those weird moments where the player may have a vision for their character, and then the role play organically opens up new doors and new growth for that character.
Well, I also think, like, even going back to your answer to the surprise question, I think it frames potentially the way that you would want to look at creating a character in a Solarpunk setting is, what do they really believe in? Because those are the same things, even talking backwards through some of the conflict, is there are if you look at these different societies and these different cultures, there are going to be touch points that are somewhat non-negotiable. Those are the things that their culture and their society is founded upon. And so, like, again, foundation, like, these are things that can't change. So then you have to find the ways that in the pieces that in parts that can change. And the same can be true of your character, because I can be a fighter that believes I should not kill anybody unless I don't have any other choice. I mean, I know that's a personal perspective. With all the years of martial arts training I did, all I learned is that the last thing I ever want to do in my entire life is be in a fight. It's not fun to get hit. But the idea that if I did find myself there, I would do everything in my power to try and get back out of that situation as well. And finding what is most meaningful to your character and operating in that, because, again, the whole basis is that they have hope that can work. Again, looking back to Grimdark and just being like, I don't have hope. I just got right now.
Yeah. I did. It's really interesting when you brought that up about your own martial arts training. I did many years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I remember the first time I was allowed to roll for the first time, or to for those who don't understand the term roll, is like you're kind of sparring against somebody else. And the first time I did it, and it was like all adrenaline and kind of like crazy movements. And you just like all the training goes out in your head and you just kind of like flailing. And because of that, I started playing some of my fighters a little weird. Is like, I would just be like, oh yeah, I just give up my own initiative, or I skip this round because like my first level fighter is completely paralyzed with terror now that he actually has to pull out a sword and do something with it. Like, he doesn't know what to do. Or I remember one time, like, I was in a fight with a fighter and it was like, it got bloody really quick before it was my turn. And I was like, yeah, my fighter vomits. He just starts throwing up because he's so like overwhelmed with nerves and the blood and gore. And I think the players at the table are like, wait, what are you doing? And I was like, he's first level. Like, this is the first real fight. He's the first time he's seen blood in combat. He doesn't know what he's doing, right? He's scared out of his wits. And that's kind of fun. If you can survive those moments, it can be fun, because then you can just start learning some new things about it.
Yeah, and the training that I did, they would, we would spar, and the guy that taught me was very good about the psychology of some of it. And he said, to do the other person on the other side a favor, you need to hit them, because, like you're saying, one of the things about being in your first fight is you get hit and your brain goes, hey, what did we do to find ourselves here, and how can we find our way out? And so, but it's also, again, even going back, like, again, it's not the whole thing with the Solarpunk is it's not about the conflict. It's about having ways to get to the other side of the conflict that are tried and true. I think is another thing that, it's not like this brand new thing where like, oh, we all have the solutions. It's like, no, it's not even about having the solutions. It's about being able to find the solutions, I think is that other element of like, we don't have all the answers, but we have a system to find answers, which is a really great thing.
I mean, I think when you say it that way, I also think that like Solarpunk builds into very different ways. So like in a very like, late stage capitalistic kind of society we have right now, it's very much the mindset of like winner takes all, right? Like there's one person and they are going to win, and like their only primacy and their only goal is to win for themselves. And I think Solarpunk says, hey, there can be a mutual victory. Like we can all win. There's this we can build these scenarios where it's win-win for everybody. And maybe your victory is not as gigantic as it would be if you just cared about yourself, but maybe we all get some piece of that pie together. And I really like that. I think there's something really satisfying by saying, hey, I'm happy with this outcome. It's also cool that you're happy with this outcome. And that like we're both happy with this outcome. And I maybe want to do business with you again, and I want to see you again. And like maybe we can work on other things together because we can have more victories together, as opposed to like me winning completely and burning you down and then going, yeah, we're never going to talk because I treated you like garbage as I took over. And when you look at some of the struggles we have in modern day society, and how individuals, corporations, different structures kind of like just consume almost like a virus everything around them and just destroy for their own victories. Solarpunk says, hey, there really is a different road and a different path out there. And let's explore that.
Great. So one of the other questions we have, and one of the questions I absolutely love to ask, is there homework that we can give our listeners, and it's the best kind, things that they could read, that they could watch, that they could experience to kind of get more of those Solarpunk vibes?
Yeah, I think because the movement is pretty new, there's not a ton of material right now out there. It's certainly, in literature, you could say maybe Ursula Le Guin's like the Dispossessed might be in that kind of that realm, or Kim Stanley Robinson's Pacific Edge are books that may be worth checking out, but they were done before the term was coined, so they're not like a neat necessary fit. You can go to Amazon and actually just kind of Google like Solarpunk literature, and there's a bunch of new short story anthologies that have come out. I haven't checked them all out, but there's some good writing out there in these short story anthologies that are worth checking out, maybe seeing what else is out there. Studio Ghibli, kind of some of the movies like Castle in the Sky, that might be also kind of fit into the Solarpunk kind of idea. Video games wise, I don't know if I have any, or regular games, I don't know if I have any strong recommendations. I've heard, and I haven't checked it out myself. The game, Cities Skylines has a Green Cities expansion that like let players like create eco-friendly infrastructure and buildings. But the eco-friendly infrastructure and buildings, I think, are only one aspect of it. That's great. That's the environmental aspect, but it doesn't necessarily talk about the communal aspect of it. So, I think what's exciting about the genre is that it is relatively new. And so it's open to new ideas and new creators and new writers and new designers and new storytellers building out this vision. I think we have been trapped, from maybe the 80s, especially the early 80s onwards, in this hyper-capitalistic kind of mindset. So a lot of the stories have been around these hyper-capitalistic, winner-take-all kind of stories. And that's kind of involved, I think, from the early 80s, because grimdark was not really a thing in the early 80s per se. But cyberpunk started coming out of the 80s. And then I think grimdark evolved as that like hyper-capitalistic model started to become pervasive, and the destructiveness of that model started to become pervasive. Things like dystopia ideas started to come out of that, and grimdark started to come out of that. And I almost think this is like the next evolution. It's like, hey, okay, let's reject all of that, or let's see alternatives to that. And so the Solarpunk wave, I think, is in its nascent movement, but it is certainly starting out. And I think that'd be great to see more writing and designing around it.
Yeah. The grimdark, the best way to describe it just popped into my head. I only need 3 colors. I need black, white, and red. That's it. I've done it.
Yeah, or you can put some gray in there too.
Oh, yeah, on occasion. The one, so I looked it up, and in TV tropes, hit or miss sometimes on some things.
Yeah.
But they did bring up a really interesting one, and I would have never thought of it. But the depiction of Alderaan in Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Oh, yeah.
Because
that's a good one.
Yeah, because it's a no-weapon society. Those green spaces are interspersed between like the actual buildings that they have, and then so it was just an interesting one that I wouldn't have thought of.
I agree with that it has certainly Solarpunk elements to it for sure. It feels a relatively equitable society, low weapon or no weapon society, a harmony with nature. Yeah, sustainable environment. Yeah, I think Alderaan is, and that makes a lot of sense. I think it's, when you think about the oppositional force, Alderaan gets destroyed by the Empire. That makes a lot of sense storytelling wise, that like these two systems are in deep conflict because the Empire is like a monstrous, like grimdark or a hyper capitalistic or hyper, tyrannical society. And so, yeah, I think that's a great piece.
Yeah, another one, again, I was not prepared for, but especially with as steeped as I am because of my own children in the lore of it, is the idea that Pokemon has really interesting ways that have Solarpunk aspects, in the sense that like the industry isn't like, it's not a huge industrial place. There are just vast swaths of this realm that they're in that is completely untouched by man. Oftentimes they utilize and work with the Pokemon because, it's a children's show, so they're never just outright killing the Pokemon, and they're working with them to like even fuel that industry in certain ways. And they're like, they have these deep bonds with what are essentially animals in their world, and this interesting back and forth. So yeah, there were some really interesting elements of that are Solarpunk.
Yeah, those are great examples. I don't know Pokemon so well, so I can't comment thoughtfully on it, but that does sound like Solarpunk. I think Solarpunk has a lot of ability to imagine or reimagine in different ways. And I think that's the exciting part about it, is that like my interpretation of it's going to be different from yours, and it's going to be different from somebody that maybe is living in Tokyo versus somebody that might be living in Bangalore, right? And I think how do we get to that sustainable society or the communal aspects? I think we need a lot of creative people imagining different versions of it to get to new solutions and new community centered societies, and find better ways to live with our environment peacefully and in a very fulfilling way.
Yeah. So there's two more that I came up with. When Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, when they end up in the realm that has spoilers, if you didn't watch the MCU, I apologize. I'm not trying to spoil the thing that came out yesterday. But the idea when they end up at the one that has the Illuminati, like it has some Solarpunk vibes, because you have these skyscrapers, but like they're the green spaces that are on and near, and like basically taking over, like the symbiosis between both nature and the industrial complex of, we have so many people that need spaces to live, but also bringing nature up with it is like a really interesting place to set it, and then build out your world from there.
Yeah, and I think that's great. That's another great example. I think if people want to even just like, they Google it and they look at Google Images for Solarpunk, you're going to see some really great, amazing, interesting, inventive artwork. And that's kind of very inspirational. I looked at a lot of that artwork as I was building the Radiant Citadel, and it informed my thought process around it.
Yeah. And then the one that I'll leave us with, and then we'll get all your info to send people, is probably the grimmiest and the darkest, if you will, setting of all time is Warhammer 40,000.
Okay.
But apparently the Tau Society, that are kind of like pseudo close to space elves, apparently that's how their whole society functions on the back end. Everything that's been talked about is that it's this green space and this, like, again, that symbiosis between both like technological advancement, but also bringing nature together. But then, of course, you have just some of the grimmest and darkest stuff that is out there, from art to play to every aspect. But the idea that, again, like that Solarpunk vibe can still exist in something that is so dark.
Which makes a lot of sense. It could be a response to the darkness around it, right? And so they can be like, hey, this one enclave is pushing back against that darkness. I like that. That's kind of cool.
So then the other question, like I said, I have is, where can people go to see all of the awesome things that you're doing? And like you said, keep track. And then when we can talk about other things, we'll probably have you back on.
The easiest way to find me is probably on social media, on Twitter. You can find me at Ajit George SB. That's AJIT, my last name George, SB at Twitter. And that's where I'm probably the most active. I have a website. If you want to reach out, you can reach out that way too. And that's just, actually, if you Google my name, it's going to be one of the first things that pop up. So it's pretty quick to find. It's pretty easy to find me. If you're interested in any of my work in the nonprofit field, you can check out Shanti Bhavan Children, or you can watch the Netflix documentary series Daughters of Destiny. It's a 4-part series, a limited series on Netflix, and you can see what my full-time work looks like in India. It's a pretty cool series.
That is awesome. We will have links to all of those things in the show notes. I pointed down again. I do it every recording. No one can see me do it, but I point to the show notes like they could. I think it's just because I watch so many YouTube videos. It just feels like second nature. Yeah, just head on down there. But yeah, we'll have links to those in the show notes. And then again, just Ajit, thank you for coming on and spending some time and then sharing the good word of Solarpunk.
It was a pleasure, Neal. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you today, and I hope your listeners enjoy it and get something interesting out of Journeys to the Radiant Citadel for themselves.
We just want to thank Ajit for coming on, spending some time with us, talking about Solarpunk and all of the other things in this episode. Of course, if you wanted to get a hold of us and tell us how you've been adding Solarpunk to your game, you can always head over and email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. And of course, if you see fit, head over to your podcatcher of choice, leave us a rating and review. It is always helpful. And if you want to find us on social media, search Dungeon Masters Block. On Twitter, we're at DMS_block. And of course, we're on Facebook and hopefully wherever else we need to be. And as always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network, where you can check out other shows like Detentions and Dragons, Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, and more. And as always, thank you for listening to the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game. Good night, good luck, and keep on Dungeon Mastering.
Goodbye.